All right, you got to see this. RTX 5080 in the Ncase M2, it's looking extremely clean as always, but more importantly, look at these numbers. 70 degrees with an ambient room temp of around 25, but fan speed just under 1000 RPM. This thing has been at full load for like an hour now, and it barely even sounds like it's running. It is so quiet. I really hope the stock situation improves for these 50 series GPUs really soon. So if you are looking to upgrade, potentially you could build something like this. The form factor is insane. The performance is ridiculous. The cooling is actually surprisingly impressive, and the GPU fitment is literally perfect. This build is actually for my little brother. I'm really excited to hand this over to him. He's currently using a 3080 PC, so 3080 to 5080, that's not a bad jump at all, but more importantly, it's the cooling and the noise levels of this thing, which is going to be a huge upgrade to what he's currently using. So let me show you what parts I've used here, and then we'll talk about the performance. Now, the case that I'm using for this one is the Ncase M2, specifically the cheese grater model with that really nice hole punched front panel. The M2 is actually the smallest case out there that can fit these massive graphics cards. So let's do a bit of a test fit first. For this to work, we actually need to use the Ncase in its vertical GPU setup. So first with the Founders Edition, which is a 2-slot 304mm card, there's no problem at all. In fact, if you're going with an FE, you might as well do a flipped build like I've done in the past with the GPU at the top. Vertical GPU though still definitely works, and I think the thermals would be pretty similar. But what about the Astral from ASUS? This thing is huge. There's no way this fits, right? Well, it's 3.8 slots, 358mm in length. After removing the front panel and shifting the riser towards the middle of the case, it actually does fit. I love this side view of the card just completely filling up the length of the case. There's a couple millimeters spare at the end and more than enough between the side panel. You could actually shift the riser cable over a couple notches if you wanted. But yeah, I mean, this is crazy. The MSI Supreme SoC though is even bigger. 3.8 slots, 150mm in height, just like the Astral, but this one comes in at 1mm longer, 359, which Ncase claim is the max for the M2. And they're not wrong. The Supreme actually touches the front panel. Everything seems to close up and line up perfectly, and there doesn't seem to be any issues. But yeah, can confirm this is the absolute limit of what you can put in this case. It does fit extremely well. I mean, the fitment is so good here that the card is held into place really nicely, whereas the Astral has a little bit of wiggle room. As for the other parts that I'm throwing into this, the CPU is going to be the Ryzen 7800X3D from AMD. I would have loved to put a 9800X3D in this, but they're just out of stock everywhere. My brother's current rig has a 5900X, so this will be a nice little bump, and it also gets him set up on the AM5 platform for future upgrades. Speaking of which, I thought I'd try something new here with the Aorus B850i Pro. Seems to have everything that we need. A couple of M.2 drives, 7 USB ports, 3 fan headers. Most motherboard manufacturers seem to be taking ITX pretty seriously these days, even for their entry-level boards. I did also pick up the X870i Strix from ASUS, which I'll likely save for another build, maybe like a compact 9900X or 9950X render build. It has a lot more active cooling and just a lot more kind of VRMs and stuff going on. It's looking like the most overkill option out there if you really want to max out your compact build. For storage, keeping it simple, 2TB 990 Pro. It's a very fast NVMe drive, more than enough for him as well, and we can use one of his current drives to throw on the back for some extra storage. There is an integrated chipset and M.2 fan on this board. Hopefully we can adjust the fan curve for this because they can be pretty noisy depending on how the fan curves are set up. Then for RAM, I've gone with 32 gigs of DDR5 6000 CL28. It's a nice low latency kit at 6000 MHz. It's pretty much the sweet spot for Ryzen. This way you can run synced with the memory controller on the CPU, and you won't have any issues with compatibility, blue screens, or anything like that. Now, because the GPU is so massive for this build, we're kind of forced into liquid cooling for the CPU. And here I've gone with the NZXT Kraken 280. Kind of insane that you can fit a 280mm liquid cooler in this build, along with the biggest GPUs out there. And for those wondering, you've got around 70 millimeters of clearance above the motherboard, which is where we'll be mounting it. I've got the board in the middle position here, but I do end up lowering that all the way to the bottom by the end. This is also where I found this extremely weird design choice on this board where you can't screw in the bottom right corner. I had to remove this plastic piece to get it locked down, which is just super weird. As for the power supply, I picked up the SF850 Platinum from Corsair. The 5080 tops out at 320 watts, and our 7800X3D won't be pulling more than 100 watts on top of that. Of course, that doesn't factor in those transient peaks and spikes, but this still will be more than enough to handle everything in this build at full blast. From here, we can actually install our liquid cooler, and this is where I probably just didn't make the right choice. Look at the insane amount of cables and clutter paired with this thing. NZXT, you've got a lot of work to do here. I understand people are pairing this with other NZXT products and linking all the lighting together. I don't know, maybe it's my fault for pairing this with a super compact build. I know the Arctic Freezer 3 is a really popular choice for the M2, but it does eat into our GPU height quite a bit because the radiator is much thicker, and for that reason, it will be impeding our exhaust airflow a bit more too. Now, if I could go back in time, I'd probably go with the Corsair H115i Link instead. The cable management seems a lot better. We still get a low profile pump block and some reasonably good cooling. For this build, RGB fans as well. So yeah, I'm going to link that one below instead of this one from NZXT. It'll make things a lot easier. I'll also note here that I'm running the motherboard and power supply at the lowest positions possible on the motherboard tray, and that's to clear as much room for the radiator tubing as we can, and also to avoid any cables getting caught in the fans. At this point though, we're ready to install our GPU, and for this build, I decided to go with the ROG Astral. This is a massive quad fan design, which I think suits the end case extremely well. It will be tucked behind a mesh panel at the end of the day, but I think the gray and silver suits this build really nice, and the lighting should look pretty sick. That is without even saying the cooling on this card for a 5080 should be absolutely mental. The first time I tried to install it though, it just would not fit. The tubing was hitting the backplate and I couldn't get the card in there physically. So I rotated the pump block to have the tubes at the top, I moved the riser cable one position closer to the side panel, and that seemed to do the trick. It is honestly builds like this where I can see why people don't want to build ITX. This build was finicky, kinda messy, and very dense. To be fair though, we are pushing this form factor to the absolute limit, and I could have made this a lot easier with a different choice of CPU cooler and some better planning. So learn from my mistakes and you should be fine. With everything wrapped up though, it was absolutely worth it. I mean, just take a look at this. The GPU leaves no space at all, and also thankfully hides all of our cables. Even with the panels off, the build looks ultra clean. Now I did 3D print a very small support bracket underneath the GPU here because this card is so massive, it does sag down quite a bit without it. So yeah, I'll leave the 3D file for that one down below just in case you're going with this particular card. And also, since we're using a Gen 4 riser cable for this build, you will definitely need to set the Gen 4 speed in the BIOS, which is not too difficult to find, but yeah, definitely something that you'll want to do. Without doing that, I was getting black screens, blue screens, just a completely unusable build. I would say even before you install Windows, go ahead and set that. While you're in the BIOS, I would also recommend disabling the chipset fan for this particular motherboard because it is so noisy. Out of the box, it runs at like 14,000 RPM, which is insane and just makes my brain hurt that anyone thought that was okay. I've just completely disabled it and it seems fine so far. Even with the build completely heated up, the chipset doesn't overheat or anything. As for the temperatures, they're extremely good. I know I dunked on the 5080 in my initial review saying that it wasn't a true 4080 successor, and I still definitely stand by that. I think Nvidia should be serving up a really solid, confident product, a nice leap over last generation, regardless if they have pressure from AMD or not. But I will say, roughly 280 watt power draw with a 4-slot cooler, even inside the tiny Ncase M2, the thermals are really impressive. At full load, the GPU sits in the low 60s, and that's with a relatively warm room temperature of 25 degrees C. I was a little bit concerned as well, since the radiator is pulling in all of the hot air from our GPU, that we might see some alarming temperatures there. And I mean, low 70s with a liquid cooler is nothing impressive, but it's definitely nothing to worry about either. Even after a couple of hours, the build wasn't getting any hotter. So with the 5080 Astral sitting at those kind of temperatures, I thought I'd go ahead and make the build even quieter. Since we do have quite a lot of thermal headroom to play with, I was able to get the GPU fans sitting below 1000 RPM, with the GPU still sitting at very reasonable full load temperatures. I'm not kidding when I say that this build at full load sounds like it's idling. It is insanely quiet. These are easily my two favorite PC cases at the moment, the NCase M2 and the Formed T1. Not sponsored, not biased, I don't think anyway. I don't run affiliate links for these cases, I do not make a cent off you purchasing them, but the build quality, the cooling, and the space optimization is just on a different level. T1 is what I'm doing my own 5090 upgrade in, and I do think that if you are building with the Founders Edition card, that would go for the 4090 and the 4080 as well. You can make it work in this more compact volume, and if you do want to build something more extreme, this has proven to be a really solid option. Having said that, I do think the NCase M2 is the better PC case between the two because it can just fit larger graphics cards. I mean, something like this ROG Astral has no chance in fitting in the T1, which, I mean, is pretty self-explanatory. The card is almost the size of this entire case. So yeah, super impressed with the setup. Vertical GPU with a 280 at the top is something I can definitely recommend. It does make mid-towers look a little bit inefficient.